So there is a machine learning revolution going on, and I don't use that term lightly because it is truly capable of changing the way that we do data science and analytics, and it breaks a lot of the assumptions that we have in the mainstream press in an industry. So I'm going to explain this a little bit to you today and why I think deep learning is important and why it's so revolutionary. How many of you have heard of deep learning coming in here? How many of you used it? So a couple of people have heard about it, and one person's used it. So you'll be seeing a lot more of this, I think, over the next year or two. It's certainly getting a lot of press, for instance. So deep learning shows up in a variety of magazines, articles, and blogs. They span technical, layperson things like Wired and TechCrunch and GWO, but they also show up in Forbes and Businessweek, New York Times, The Register. So you know when a topic is showing up cross-cutting across different types of publications that there's something interesting. It's more than just one press release. It's more than one just breakthrough. If you dig a little deeper, you'll see that there's a lot of activity going on here. And the activity is describing companies that are hiring and acquiring other companies that do deep learning, companies that are claiming that they can change the way that machine learning is going to be used in organizations. And you'll see a lot of star power, like the fellows at the top of the slide. All of them, except the one in the middle, are machine learning researchers. The one in the middle you might recognize. He's a little more famous and a little wealthier. Mark Zuckerberg, he actually showed up to one of the premier machine learning conferences in December in Tahoe. And he spent about an hour with us talking about his personal passion for machine learning and deep learning and Facebook's commitment to this over the next 5 to 10 year period. So this is a really big investment. And then he turned around and hired the fellow to the right, Yann LeCun, to head up his deep learning lab in New York. So you see it a lot in the press, and you'll be seeing it more. It doesn't just show up in the press. It shows up in publications and search, which tells us that real people are doing things with deep learning. It's not just a journalist creating some hype. People are applying this and researching it in a variety of areas. On the left, you can see just a crude attempt to measure the impact of that by doing a simple count of deep learning in Google Scholar citations. This by no means represents the body of literature, but it shows you this trend. And I'll point out also that if you knew as much as I did about the dates on this, 2006 is significant. So that's the change point in the trend. It doesn't show up clearly because it's so small, but something changed in 2006, and we'll talk about that. It also shows up in search, so people are interested in applying deep learning to their problems and across their organization. Of course, a lot of these topics are related: big data, data science, machine learning, deep learning. So that's a data science exercise in itself to sort of tease out what the chicken and the egg are there. But it's certainly popular and trending. If you go to trade shows or conferences for your industry or for academia where you have some technical presentations, you might see talks on deep learning. You might see marketing materials that mention deep learning or neural networks and AI. It's become fashionable again. And if you wanted to follow the thought leaders on this and catch the very early droplets of these ideas as they come from the spigot, you would go to these conferences that I list on the page: NIPS, ICLR, ICML. These conferences are also accessible online, and as most of these have demo sessions. So you can go to their sites and you can see real live examples of deep learning systems, read papers, and see what's going on in the space. It's not just publication search and journalists. You may not be aware, but deep learning is actually making its way into your life in industry and products. One of the big success cases for deep learning is speech recognition. For a number of years, automatic speech recognition was kind of stalled at some level of accuracy. Let's call it 80%. Deep learning comes along, and now you're at 85, 88, or 90%. It's an amazing needle mover. If you're in the speech industry, you'll know how significant that is. And this is from work that was done in three to 6 months by postdocs. They don't have 20 years as speech researchers. And so you'll see deep learning in Android voice recognition, Apple Siri, and almost every other speech recognition system out there today. But it goes beyond speech, too. At Google, for instance, they're so committed to deep learning that they are putting it in as many products as they can, and they have entire teams that are working on this. So it shows up in maps and image search and other products that they don't talk about publicly. It's not limited to Google and Apple or Facebook and Microsoft or Baidu, although those are certainly the companies that are focused on it right now. But it's spread to other products, too. If you're doing topic modeling or sentiment analysis or genomics or time series prediction, There's probably an application by some startup or established company using deep learning in your space. Why is deep learning so revolutionary? One of the reasons is because it is being used in all of these spaces, because it achieves state-of-the-art results in all these different domains. And previously, yes?
What is deep learning?
Yes, we're getting to that. So it is used in all these domains because it's achieving these state-of-the-art results. So no other technique before has been so dominantly applied across a broad variety of domains, at least not in the last 20 or 30 years. So with all this excitement and activity in deep learning, we want to know, where is it happening? And right now, it's a pretty small nucleus of activity. There are some labs around the world that have deep learning expertise. In North America, there's a small handful, probably leads the world. Yoshio Bengio and Geoffrey Hinton, CS professors up in Canada. Jan LeCun, who's in New York. Andrew Ng, you might have seen him on your Coursera course. And of course, Microsoft and the whole Seattle complex are involved. But collectively, this is still a pretty limited amount of activity at the very highest levels. So even though deep learning is really popular and is beginning to spread, the epicenters are small. And the reason the epicenters are small is because it's expensive, it takes a lot of time, it takes computing power, it takes knowledge. There's no deep learning toolbox that you can download today and instantly get these amazing Google results. We're getting there, but it's not quite there yet. So there's a lot of interest in deep learning and a lot of buzz, and you've heard about it in this revolution. So what is it? Where did it come from? Why is it important? Does it matter to you? Do you believe the hype? So to talk about that, I want to go back and show a canonical problem that we would do, that we would solve as a data scientist before deep learning. This is a classification problem. We want to build a cat detector, maybe a cat detector versus a dog detector. And we want to look at how we did this before deep learning came along. And the recipe was generally pretty straightforward. We would collect some data from cats and dogs, these images of cats and dogs. We would label them, so we would know which ones are cats and dogs. We would pick an algorithm to go in this blue box called a classifier. We'd run a script, train it up, the math would work, and at the end of the day, we would be left with this magic box that we could give it an image and it would tell us cat or dog. Right? The inputs get mapped to labels. And we want to do that for less than $1 million. Does anybody know why I have the $1 million number up there? I have the $1 million number up there because, tongue-in-cheek, one of the first successful press releases for Google for deep learning applications was a cat detector in images. And they built this system to detect cats. It took them 1,000 nodes, 1 week of runtime for each iteration of training their model. And each node has 16 cores. So this was a very expensive cat detector. They actually had about $1 million budget for this. Well, of course, we're not going to spend $1 million on this. You probably can't justify it. But it does point out a couple of things. One, Google is interested enough in this that they're willing to invest this kind of money in little experimental projects. And two, that the results, for us to achieve Google-level results, we're going to need some breakthroughs in the technology because we can't afford to do those same experiments. So we want to build a cat detector, and we don't necessarily think about it in the before time, but we're actually faced with two problems. We don't think about it too much because we haven't had the ubiquity of the data and the tools and the computing that we do today. But the first problem that we face is labeled data. Labels are expensive. Somebody has to go scrape images of cats and write down that this is a cat. Somebody has to make sure it really is a cat and not a competitor trying to throw dogs into your cat detector. Somebody has to make sure that it's well cropped. Somebody has to make sure that you've represented all the different types of cats that you could possibly encounter. It's no problem for me and my mom to crowdsource this and get 100 images, but for an organization to scale to hundreds of thousands or millions or billions of images, that's expensive. So what happens is, in the before period, we have kind of this implied budget for data. We're only going to be able to collect so much data. We're only going to be able to check the labels so much. And that limits the amount of data that we can put into our learning system. So we're left with this big pile of unused and unlabeled data that intuitively know is valuable. This is the whole big data story, right? It's wonderful, but we don't know what to do with it. And we don't have the money to go through and sift it. The second problem is features. So the little secret in data science is that we typically take raw data inputs and do some transformation to make them data that's more representative for learning on. So in this example, for instance, I'm showing that we might start with an image which consists of pixels, a pile of numbers, and we might run something on it called SIFT, which is a fancy feature detector, which would reduce a big pile of numbers to a smaller pile of numbers that were easier to learn on. And that smaller pile of numbers might be something like interesting points in the image, like I'm trying to show with the blue pluses, and the distances and angles between them. Now, SIFT is actually a real algorithm, and David Lowe spent 10 years, he and his colleagues spent 10 years perfecting this. 10 years of PhD-level research is way too much to develop features. And so immediately we know that, one, the success of our algorithms are going to rely on good feature representations. That's the dirty secret. And two, we can't afford to invent features for every problem we face. SIFT is great, but it doesn't apply to everything. So we're kind of left without a strategy, and this is the dirty secret that we don't talk about, which is how do we go from raw data to features that are interesting to learning. In fact, this is kind of a snapshot. On the left, we have data and we have features, and these are the things that take the most time, and these are the things that are the most critical to starting out on a path to success for our projects. On the right, we have our algorithms, our bag of tools and tricks and techniques. This is your Kaggle list of random forests, support vector machines, k-nearest neighbors, blah, blah, blah. All of these are wonderful and they're interesting, and we talk about them as if they're the important part, but the left-hand side is where we make or break it to begin with. And we don't have a principled way to explore the left-hand side before deep learning. So let's go back for a second and challenge these assumptions and look and see what the world would be like if we could change the labeling data and the features problem. So the first question is, how good is more data? Maybe I could afford to label more data, or maybe I could find some magic way to convert unlabeled data into something usable. If I did that, how much would it pay off? Well, this is an experiment conducted in 2001 on a natural language processing task where they were trying to label words. The words were two, and two, T-O, T-W-O, T-O-O. They were trying to disambiguate it. This is a classification task. And the researchers here were interested. They had a bag of techniques from the day, and they were interested in studying how the accuracy and performance of those techniques varied as they presented their algorithms more and more training data. So they swept it from 1 million to 1 billion words. And what you can see here is more data dominates techniques. In the beginning, with 1 million words, with an 82.5% nominal accuracy, there is some spread in the performance of different techniques. So in the small or medium data regime, it is kind of important which technique you use. But by the time you get to the right-hand edge of the curve, almost all the techniques are tightly clustered around whatever gain you can get from that particular data set. And so if you have a choice, the implication is, don't spend time perfecting the techniques, spend time collecting more data. Now, I put an asterisk there because that's not exactly true. Amazing techniques can give you huge game-changing breakthroughs, but they're risky. Collecting more data is a lot less risky. Often we do have lots of data, right? If I want to build a cat detector today, I could go scrape Yahoo, Flickr, Google, etc. I just don't have the labels. So I know that if I had access to something that would let me use that data, then I could win in this machine learning type of paradigm because I have more data and the technique doesn't matter as much. The problem is I don't have a way to use the unlabeled data yet. So this was one of the first motivations for deep learning. How can we make use of all this unlabeled data to get a win? And is it going to be a win? Well, it looks like it will if we can do something like that. The second challenge is the impact of features. So features are critical. I mean, if I try to measure whether a car is speeding by detecting the color of its tires, I'm not going to get anywhere. That's not a very good feature. That's not very good data to start with. But if I look at the wheel diameter, if I look at the weight, if I look at properties of the car, I'm going to do better. All right? But these features, they're coming from my human creativity and expertise. There's not a rigorous way to approach the feature problem. It's basically a creative human endeavor that requires domain-specific or problem-specific knowledge. If you get stuck, the best you can do is go look at some other domain at the features they use and try to bring them over. But if we had some way to automatically generate features, even if they were simple or imperfect, then we could start doing this exploration cycle exponentially faster, and we could see that with big data and some automatic features, we hope to have a big win. So putting those ideas together, this is the vision of what we want from machine learning. We're going to assume that on the left, now, we have bountiful data. Maybe as much data as we want. Not all of it's labeled, but some of it's labeled. And on the right, we're going to look for some sort of approach that takes as much of the human out of the loop as possible to automatically extract features and to do the classification or learning at the same time. If we can do that, then we can mine these big data sets, and we can change the scale from being human limited, how many PhDs can you hire to work on your data, to compute limited. How many nodes can you scale up with in your organization? And that's a much better economics. And that's the intuition for deep networks. So deep neural networks are a form of deep learning where we attempt to represent a learning problem in intermediate stages of feature representation. And the goal is we're going to find a magic box, an algorithm, if you will, a model, that allows us to just slightly take input data and produce a slightly better, more informative representation on the outputs. That's that feature extraction. And then we're going to stack them up. And that changes the problem from having to learn everything all in one shot to being able to learn things stage-wise. And we know, theoretically and empirically, that this can be good for good classes of data. Now, in this example, I'm showing an illustration of this with a car. This is real data from a real deep learning network, okay? And the output is tapped at each layer of a neural network, and I'll show that in a few slides. And we start with an image of a car, but it could be lots of images. This network could have been trained on cars and horses and stadiums. And what we see at the first layer is that it has learned that good compositional parts for images are edges and corners, which is no secret, by the way. That's the human visual system also does that. We learn in the very early stages of our visual processing to detect edges and corners because that is a great way to find objects and scenes. And then as we go through this network, we see that, okay, edges and corners combine to represent panels and doors and windows and tires and different parts of the image. And as we go up to the next step, we see, okay, well, different parts of these car scenes give us different views of a car or different types of cars. And we keep building in this fashion. And as long as the data set is amenable to this hierarchical representation, it makes it tractable and easier to learn. And that pink box that you see in the middle, the 4 pink boxes, those feature mappings, they are reusable. They're trainable. I have to customize it to the learning problem, but physically, me as a person, I don't have to do much once I set the problem up. So I've changed this human-limited problem, where I only have so much time to explore data and visualize it, to a compute-limited problem, where as long as I can get the computing power and mastermind the experiment, I can run lots of them. Here's another example of a feature hierarchy just to show you. You might take heads and represent them in a 3-layer hierarchy. And if you do this, you actually will get edges and parts of faces like eyes and nose and ears, and actually entire faces. And then if you wanted to classify a particular face, you could slap on your favorite classification algorithm on top of that and go right there. And in fact, that's what the breakthrough was. So in 2006, Geoffrey Hinton, who is an esteemed professor in computer science at the University of Toronto and a long-term neural networks expert, he's been working on it since the 70s, he and his colleagues released a pair of papers that literally split time in the machine learning world. Because before 2006, although everybody who was in the field knew that they wanted to be able to use unlabeled data, and they wanted to be able to use lots of data, they didn't really have a recipe for it. They didn't know how to do it, all right? And they certainly didn't know how to do it with neural networks, which is what most people associate with deep learning networks. In 2006, Hinton provided the paper which gave the theoretical and the practical and the performance results, which tied it all together, and everybody took note. And within a year or so, people were beginning to adopt these ideas. So what was in his paper that was interesting? So the paper was called Deep Belief Nets. And you can go look at it. It's pretty easy to read. You can skim through the math, et cetera, and just see what he's doing at a high level. What he's doing at a high level is he's got a new architecture for a neural network that he's applied to a toy problem, which I'm going to explain. And the way that he applies it is a little bit different way of thinking about it. And that allowed him to overcome some of the limitations that held neural networks back from the 90s until this 2006 paper. So the first ingredient is the data. And this data you might have seen before. How many of you have seen the MNIST data set? Just a couple willing to raise their hands. And the rest of you, I know, might have seen something. So the MNIST data set is a common computer vision and machine learning data set. It's easy for us to visually understand what's going on with the data. It's a collection of 60,000 training and 10,000 test grayscale handwritten images. So imagine these are scraped right off of a letter for zip codes. And the goal is to be able to classify one of those test images as the number that it is, which is actually a nice problem because it's a multiple class classification problem. I have 10 digits, right? So Hinton created a neural network that took each of those images. He resampled the images to be 28 by 28 pixels. And in common fashion, if you've ever done this with computer vision, you basically have this 28 by 28 matrix of numbers which you just unroll into one vector. In this case, it'd be 784 numbers long. And that's the input to his neural network. Now, we'll talk about how a neural network works in a second, but what a neural network does, in essence, is it stage-wise processes data from the layer before it to the layer after it, doing some math transformation until you get the final output. Now, what he did in this example is he did something called unsupervised pre-training. So people have tried in the past to stack neural networks so they have multiple layers of neurons, because if you examine the brain, for instance, of the human, the cortical column, we have between 8 and 14 layers of neurons. So information gets filtered slowly up the layers. So that's a good inspiration to use for our machine learning algorithms. The problem is that numerically it didn't work very well. So people weren't able to train these networks. And they didn't know exactly why. So what Hinton did was he took a layer and he trained it in an unsupervised fashion at a time and used the output of that layer to train the next layer. So what do I mean by unsupervised? What I mean by unsupervised is instead of giving me a pile of zeros and telling me they're zeros, I'm going to give you a pile of 0 images, and you're going to figure out what they are. You're going to have some model for it. Maybe you'll say, in this corner, there aren't very many pixels. And over here, there's a lot of lines. You're going to come up with those features. And those features look like the edges and the corners that we showed in the previous slide. That's what they learn. And if I do that, and I feed the output of one layer into the next layer successively, what I'm doing is building a representation, in general, of what images are, what this image data set is. The neural network learns not about 0s through 9s, but it learns in this data set, the things that are interesting are the edges, are the curves, are the blank spots, are the height, are the width, and it does this in an automatic fashion, layer-wise by layer-wise. And then, once he's got that trained, he slaps on a final neural network layer and trains it in the more traditional supervised fashion, which says, okay, now that you've got some representations of what these images are, let me show you again. Let's go through our data set. This is a 0. This should be a 0. What did you say it was? If there's an error, let's adjust your weights and update. So supervised training, we give the network the answers of what it's supposed to be learning. But the trick here is he took the time to pre-train the network. So he combined the unsupervised and the supervised. And that was pretty interesting because that overcame the training problem for neural networks. Now, the MNIST data set is not very challenging. Your mom could throw darts and get 90% accuracy. But it's interesting because it used to be a big data problem back in the day of 46s, right? And you have 50 megabytes of images and things. And it's been well studied by every algorithm under the sun. So anything that we learn, we can probably compare to other techniques and maybe do some generalization. So what he showed at the time was state-of-the-art performance on his test data set of 1.25% errors, which means 125 out of those 10,000 test images that were never used, he labeled incorrectly, according to the humans who created the data set, by the way. And that was better than the SVM and the KNNs of the day and all the other algorithms. It wasn't the very best algorithm of all. That bottom line, ConvNet, is another form of neural network that's been around for a while. It was superior, but it behaves differently, so we exclude that from this discussion for a moment. So, in the complete package, he had a formula for how to train these things, an architecture for how to put these neural networks together. He had results, and he had the math to back it up. So he had the whole package. There really wasn't denying that there was something real going on. The only question is, how far could it go, and what did it mean? Do you guys, there you go. So sometimes I get asked what those errors look like and what the data set looks like, and I'd just like to put this in as an aside. These data are from another paper reproducing a similar type of experiment, and these are the top 35 errors from that paper. And in the upper right-hand corner, if you can make it out, you can see the true label according to the human who created the data set. And in the lower right-hand corner, you can see the top 2 labels that this person's neural network output. And as an example, you can see that something like a 5, as highlighted here, might be hard even for a human to characterize, especially taken out of context. If I just chicken scratch this for you, you know, this isn't even a number. This is a character from some other alphabet, maybe. So what's interesting is these machine learning algorithms already achieve pretty much human or better than human performance on these data sets. And so sometimes picking over 0.75% or 0.85% accuracy might be noise. Right? But if you can get into that regime with a new algorithm that scales, that's not noise. That's interesting. So Hinton's paper capitalized on the key ideas that we talked about and brought everybody's attention to this deep learning paradigm and actually started creating the nomenclature for deep learning. And remember, the first thing is we want to learn from all the data that we have. Now, in Hinton's paper, what he did was he learned from the unlabeled data to begin with, even though he had labels. But he showed you can learn from all this unlabeled data to get the network close to understanding something about the domain of the data. And then you can take a few labeled examples, which are expensive, and fine-tune it. And this strategy is repeatable today, and I'll show you an example of how powerful this can be. The second thing is we decided that we wanted to have a deep representation of the data, of the features. So this deep representation allows us to solve the learning problem in stage-wise, easier steps. All right? The third thing is he gave us practical training. So before some of the training techniques that he mentions in his paper, even if you had these ideas, you weren't able to make traction in neural networks or other architectures. We're focusing on neural networks here. So he gave some practical tips for how this would work. And finally, state of the art always talks. So if you can beat somebody's result fairly and reproducibly, then it's interesting to everybody. So armed with this, we kind of have a new model of the Cat Detector that we might try if we were starting a Cat Detector company. We might go and scrape 1 million or 1 billion images off of the web and feed them into a deep learning network, just like Hinton's, that would learn representations of natural images. And the fact that we get some rocks and spaceships and moons and TV stars and things in there, that's okay, because it's learning how to perceive images. And then we would spend the time to label a few very correctly labeled examples to supervise the network. So this fine-tunes it so that it goes from a general knowledge of what represents images to what represents cats. And then we would have a state-of-the-art detector. Now, the implications of this are amazing because if you spend a lot of time applying your domain knowledge to your data to come up with these proprietary features, which is what a lot of data science and analytics are. It's encoding your geolocations, it's encoding your transactional histories, it's encoding your demographic data into these proprietary features, which everybody then plugs into a core set of common algorithms, right? Generalized linear regression, or random forests, or k-nearest neighbors, or whatever, right? Just go buy any book on data science and machine learning, and you'll see the list, the recipe of 10 techniques. So what separates you from your competitors? What separates you is that you have this proprietary data, this proprietary representation, and this skill in tuning it all together. But now I'm telling you that I can go get tons of data and take away one of those advantages potentially, the proprietary representation with deep learning. And so I don't necessarily have to be a domain or subject matter expert, at least not at the same level that I would have had to be in the past. So this is startup scale. This is disruptive technology. This is one of the reasons Google is cornering the market on it. Did you guys read about the acquisition of DeepMind? DeepMind is a deep learning company that was acquired in January by Google. They've been acquiring deep learning companies. They paid over $33 million per employee for that company. That's a lot of money for a company that's not producing a lot of revenue. So, okay, so that's kind of an overview of the origins of deep learning. Now, what does it look like? So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on the mechanics of neural networks or anything, but I want to give you kind of a high-level overview for those of you who haven't seen it, or a refresher. So this is my personal take. So a neural network processes data in layers. In this example, I'm showing data flowing through a graph. The graph is directed and acyclic. The data enters in the bottom and goes through to the top. Each time it hits a layer of neurons, it gets summed and transformed and output on the following layer. And as we do that, we're adjusting the connection weights between all of those nodes, and the connection weights are what gives the neural network its learning capability. If you could randomly guess the pile of weights, we wouldn't even have to train it. That's how the neural network works. So as an example, maybe we have an image of a cat, or maybe we have a real cat, and we decide to measure some data from it. And here I'm showing weight and the number of teeth and the number of whiskers. And my task is try to determine if this is a cat or a dog, for instance. So I measure those, and I get numbers, and I encode those numbers into the neural network as inputs or features. I take those numbers, and I propagate them to the next line, to the next layer. And every connection between the input layer and the next layer, I multiply those numbers by a weight. And initially, those weights are randomly initialized, and the learning algorithm helps them converge to meaningful values. At each node in that middle layer, I sum up all of the weights of the inbound activity, and I fire and produce an output. And we have different firing rules we can use as an example, but you could simply just sum them all up. And the activations that I'm expressing here kind of indicate what each neuron in the middle layer is thinking, potentially, about how much of a cat or a dog it is, green being a cat, red being a dog. And then I repeat that where I take my outputs from the middle layer, multiply it by the connection weights, and sum the inputs to the next neurons. And I keep doing that until I'm out of layers. And that's how we do forward propagation in a network. So when I present an example, it goes and flows up through the network. It fires the final output layer. The output layer says, hey, this is 80% cat and 20% dog. Now, if I want to train the network, then I need to go backwards also. So I need to look and say, hey, this actually is a cat. So you're pretty close on the cat side, so you don't need to tweak your weights back very much. But the dog side, you're off, so you need to make some changes. And I take that error, which is proportional, I take that error and I propagate it back through the network and change the weights according to how much of an error each weight contributed. And that feed-forward back propagation is how we train a neural network. And what we do is we cycle through all the samples in our data set through several epochs. So we go through them once, we go through them twice, we go through them 3 times. And this is where we start getting into the black art of training neural networks, because how many times do you go? How do you present them? These are the rules that you have to go Google about to find out how to make it actually work. And this is part of what makes neural networks more difficult than other algorithms, because there is a lot of subjectivity. There are a lot of what we call hyperparameters which we have to tune, which you don't have in other models, like random forest. Random forest is really hard to overtrain, okay? But the potential win is big. Now, after we train a neural network, we have, on the left, we have a neural network. What's important are the weights. All of the magic is encoded in the weights. And the weights describe the connections between any 2 layers in that graph. And so for each layer, we have a list, a pile of numbers. That's what we want. That's the output of our model. And then we can reproduce the neural network at will because we know what the architecture was, and we can classify an example or continue to train. And if we have a list of weights for each layer, well, we can unfold that vector into a matrix. So now we have a matrix of weights, and we can view that matrix as an image. And that image is what you were seeing in the first couple of slides about the representations of features that a network was learning. So a neural network encodes its knowledge in the weights, and we can visualize those weights to understand a little bit about what the network's doing. We also get a lot of performance and tuning and logging data, because training neural networks isn't about preparing the data or posing the problem so much as it is being a systems engineer and making sure that the neural network converges and achieves the answer you want. And so we're looking at a lot of the metadata of the training process, where in random forest, you might, in R, Python, or whatever, run a model, get the result, and never look at the statistical significance or how many iterations it took or anything like that, because you trust it. In neural networks, you have to pay attention to those details. OK, so what's different between a neural network and a deep neural network? Well, it's just scale. Okay? So in a deep neural network, we have more layers in the middle, and these layers have thousands of nodes usually. And those thousands of nodes are fully connected, which gives us millions or billions of edges. So now we have a graph problem that we're learning on with millions or billions of edges that we have to iterate on until it's converged. And so this becomes computationally expensive. This is why Google had to spend a week to train their model once. And because it's a graph problem, you can't just cut it and split it simply like you can a lot of other algorithms to make it simply parallel, because the graph connections are what's important in the learning. And so this is a very active area of research right now. And the best that people do is they use machines with GPUs, because GPUs have big pipelines. Now, if you want to get into the neural network game, I mentioned there's a lot of tricks of the trade. So they show up as building blocks, if you will, and how you stitch together your little experiment at your workbench. You've got to pick a topology, which how many layers, how many nodes. You've got to pick how the neuron activates. You've got to pick the rules for how you train. There's a lot of special magic numbers that you have to pick. We call them hyperparameters. And it can be done, and it can be done in a principled manner, but there's a lot of opportunity for naive experimenters to make mistakes. So that's why they're a little risky. In fact, this is one of the reasons they went out of vogue in the 80s to begin with. So let's look at a couple of applications real quick, and then I'll show you how you could get started. So the first application, ImageNet, which was presented by Alex Krzyzewski and Jeffrey Hinton in 2012 at NIPS. ImageNet was a contest to classify images that were collected, 1 million images across 1,000 different classes, and the rules of the game were this. We'll give you an image, you give us your top 5 votes for what that image is. If you get it right, you get a +1. If not, you get a -1. So the state of the art across all the academic universities and industrial research labs that entered this contest was a 27% test error, which means that 27% of the time, they couldn't get the image correctly labeled within their top 5. Alex Krzyzewski got 16% as a postdoc using deep learning methods, and was so successful that Google acquired his company, him, his colleague, and I guess some part-time Jeffrey Hinton time. So this is a kind of a landmark example. This code is open source, so you can go read about how this works, but it's not trivial to work with. This is an example in ImageNet, just to solidify what's going on. This is an abacus image. The abacus label was generated by a human committee, so there's some ground truth. We know this is an abacus. The 5 labels under it were generated by the ImageNet deep learning neural network. And the degree, the width of the bar, the color is a red herring. It doesn't matter. The width of the bar shows the confidence of the network that that is the best label. So in the abacus example, all the weight is on abacus. It's pretty dang sure this is an abacus. But in other examples, it's not so sure. And if you inspect it, you'll see that it tends to make sensible mistakes also when it is wrong, much like the digits we showed. Here's an example in medical image processing where on the left-hand side, you frequently have slide stains that you want to classify by region of cell boundaries or other markers. And this is an example where they were able to do that, so they pseudo-colored it so you could see what the cells were. This is a state-of-the-art result. It's pretty, printed out, hanging on your wall. If you want to read more of the references here. This is an important one to note. The Caltech 256 database is a collection of different views of objects. So they take teddy bears and they get different views, different colors, different illumination and pose, different hats. And so the experimenters, Rob Fergus and his colleague, trained a deep learning neural network on images that didn't have anything to do with this database, 1 million+ images, and then slowly did this experiment. If I just train on 1 example, how accurate am I? If I train on 2 examples, how accurate am I? And you can see that by just training on 6 examples from the data set, after having all this pre-training work, that they exceeded the state of the art. Again, that's amazing. That means that you have the power to disrupt somebody's intellectual property because they may have spent years building these detection, classification, learning systems, and you can go learn off of open data in the wild and just get a handful of labeled examples and match their performance. I won't go into this one except to say this is like a voice print, and the task here was to segment the voice print into the sections that we call phonemes. These are the fundamental sounds that we make when we speak. When we speak, it's a classic speech processing task, and this one achieves state-of-the-art results. This is a common theme. This one achieves state-of-the-art results. And there's a long list of others. From Kaggle contests, where grad students were just hanging out in the lab and they won the molecular prediction. The molecular prediction problem is worth mentioning. This was a grad student of Hinton's who won this Kaggle contest, and as part of the prize, he has to describe what he did. And the Kaggle committee asked him, the sponsor Merck and the Kaggle committee asked him, what quantitative chemistry techniques did you use to solve this problem? And he's like, I don't know what you're talking about. I just took the data and fed it into my network and learned. This breaks that domain expertise argument that people have fallen on so strongly. And it shows that, I mean, you can't do it overnight, but you are able to apply this problem universally once you learn the basic techniques of deep learning. It shows up in text and video and recommendation systems. Netflix just announced in February that they're going to start using deep learning for personalized content and recommendations. They're doing this on a big cloud scale effort. They're scooping up resources. So it's all exciting, and the question you might have now is kind of where do I get it? And I think the answer is mixed. So one, you can be acqui-hired by Google, and then you'll have access to Google's system. For the rest of us, Python is a great place. And in particular, there's a library called PyLearn2. And as an example, there's a snippet of code on the left, which is not exactly a deep neural network, but it is a neural network. And so it shows you that in just a few lines of code, you can build a classifier for this MNIST digit problem that we've been looking at. And if you were to run this on your MacBook or something like that, it takes less than 30 minutes. Maybe much less than 30 minutes. I haven't been able to time it on my recent laptop. And it gives you state-of-the-art performance. And it uses a GPU. The license is permissive, BSD clause 3, so you can use it as you like and contribute. And the underlying enablers are Python, and I put up here IPython because that's a great distribution, a great shell for Python if you're a user. And Theano is the magic that makes it know how to do the deep learning stuff. If Python's not your thing, there's a new player in town, H2O, by OX Data, which is it's supposed to be kind of a Hadoop stack for machine learning. It's distributed in memory, has a nice license with Apache 2.0. It allows you to specify your models as JSON, so that's really convenient because that makes your experiment cycles really easy. You can version and track them and understand them. You can read about it at the website there. And you can see that it integrates with your Hadoop or HDFS ecosystem in a variety of different ways and with different connectors, et cetera. It looks like a really good project. This is an example that they provided. You can Google around and find this on the web, where they show how to do deep learning on this MNIST digit classification problem we've been talking about using the framework. And what they essentially do is they keep the weights in a key value store that's atomic and fast, and then they propagate the learning. What they do is they parallelize, and they train in copies of the network on parts of the data in parallel, and then in the reduced stage, they average the weights. And it works. They get great results. The problem is it sucks at time, because it took about 10 hours for them to do this on one node, but I just told you I can do it in a few minutes on my MacBook. And even if I don't use a GPU on my MacBook, it still only takes a few minutes. So the reason is because graph problems, especially fully connected graphs with the computations we're doing, they don't scale very well, and the communication intensity is really the bottleneck. So you really, if you have to go off device, it's a loss. In fact, that's why GPUs are so good, because they have higher bandwidth in these parallel bit streams. So it's really important to think about that in your deep learning, how you're going to be able to scale. The MNIST data set that we trained here, 60,000 examples, 10 hours. What if you have 1 billion rows? You're going to be there till the end of time, right? Call Google, start giving them money. There are other resources. I'll make the SlideShare available online. I'll just mention that these projects use a variety of Python or MATLAB or JavaScript or Lua. Torch 7 is built on Lua. You don't have access to Disbelief. That's Google's system. Google announced a paper in this in 2012. You can read it on the NIPS paper website, and it shows you how they parallelize. This is basically their version of MapReduce for deep learning. And they go into enough details that you can salivate because you wish you had it, but not enough details to reproduce it. And Netflix has a recent blog post where they talk about how they parallelize their deep learning using Celery and Python and some traditional frameworks. So these are out there. Noticeably missing is R. So R is probably never going to get deep learning until there's a gateway, something in R that you can call some other back-end service, because deep learning is just so computationally expensive. So in a nutshell, the key ideas in deep learning is we're going to trade off engineering features by humans in a cubbyhole with domain expertise to architectures that anybody can work with and techniques for understanding when the architectures converge. We're going to use deep features versus shallow features because that gives us better results. The features that we learn are automatic in some sense, and that's good enough to start doing big, large-scale exploratory analysis. This allows us to use lots and lots of data, and deep learning really shines when you have lots of data. And it allows us to focus on the data versus the technique, because deep learning is already a great technique. It changes the equation from human-intensive capital to compute-intensive capital. So if you can't afford 10 or 20 PhDs, deep learning with a lot of nodes may be a good answer. It gives us state-of-the-art results across almost every domain that it's been applied to. Some of that's probably because the people are motivated and smart, but come on, every single domain, genomics, images, speech, this is amazing. It breaks that expert domain barrier that we like to say. You have to really be a SME in a subject. You have to spend a lot of time. You have to be embedded for a long period of time. That's not as true now. It's still true, but not as true. And it could change radically. So if your business is built upon having some business domain expertise, only you know how to interpret the data that you're using, be prepared for revolution in the coming years, because that's going to change. The details and tricks are complex. There are entire books about how to train neural networks and classes that you can take, including a class on Coursera. And the tools are very early, so you can't really just drop this into your enterprise big data application right now. But you can learn. You can siphon off a sample of data, and deep learning as a strong learner will give you interesting insights which you could use to either implement a custom solution or to go back and use one of your other algorithms to use features that you've discovered with deep learning. If you have any questions or comments or want to get in touch with me, please feel free to link in with me, whether you want to network, you just have a general question, you have a project or training, or you want to say hi, I'm available. And that's it.